Welcome to Young Heretics, where today we are talking about bad kings. And now a reading from the first book of Samuel, chapter 8. Then all the elders of Israel gathered together and came to Samuel at Ramah, and said to him, "You are old, and your sons do not follow in your ways. Appoint for us, then, a king to govern us, like other nations." But the thing displeased Samuel when they said, "Give us a king to govern us." Samuel prayed to the Lord, and the Lord said to Samuel, "Listen to the voice of the people in all that they say to you, for they have not rejected you, but they have rejected me from being king over them, just as they have done to me from the day I brought them up out of Egypt to this day, forsaking me and serving other gods, and also they are doing this to you. Now then, listen to their voice. Only you shall solemnly warn them and show them the ways of the king who shall reign over them." So Samuel reported all the words of the Lord to the people who were asking him for a king. He said, "These will be the ways of the king who will reign over you. He will take your sons and appoint them to his chariots and to be his horsemen and to run before his chariots. And he will appoint for himself commanders of thousands and commanders of fifties, and some to plow his ground and to reap his harvest and to make his implements of war and the equipment of his chariots. He will take your daughters to be perfumers and cooks and bakers. He will take the best of your fields and vineyards and olive orchards and give them to his courtiers. He will take 1/10 of your grain and of your vineyard and give it to his officers and his courtiers. He will take your male and female slaves and the best of your cattle and donkeys and put them to his work. He will take 1/10 of your flocks, and you shall be his slaves. And in that day you will cry out because of your king, whom you have chosen for yourselves, but the Lord will not answer you in that day." Let us pause for just a moment and bring you a word from our sponsors. So, you may have noticed that we have been talking for these 2 whole episodes about Livy, who wrote in Latin. And it is my great joy to bring you all of this stuff and to try to make it alive and to convince you that it's not some big scary thing that you can't think about or that is only for experts or whatever, but rather part of your cultural heritage to take ownership of. One of the ways to do that is to read these things in the original language. It's part of how you grasp the true artistry of what these guys are doing and come sort of face to face with the great writers of the past. Now, that can be very daunting, and a lot of people have asked me, how do I get to learn these languages, hopefully without, vast, terrifying lists of memorization and verb forms and so forth? Well, the Ancient Language Institute is your solution. This is where you basically learn an ancient language as if it were a living language. So you read and you speak and you write in the language from day one. It's a much more intuitive way to grasp the subtleties of these languages. And they're running a promo. It's soon to finish. It's up through January 15th. So go now, if you're interested, to ancientlanguage.com/youngheretics and enter the promo code heretics to get 15% off. So that's HERETICS, just like in the title. And if you enter, you get 15% off. It's ancientlanguage.com/youngheretics, promo code heretics. All right, excellent. Back to the show. As I said last week, this is a 2-part episode. The first part was about the kings of Rome, the 2 first kings of Rome, who I think it's fair to say were good kings. And Livy represents them that way. And he notes also, as I said in that episode, he notes that it was good for this gang of essentially outlaws, these rough and tumble rapscallions that founded Rome. It was good for them to be under virtuous kings who could lead them in the paths of civilization building. And of course, Livy himself is living under Augustus, and so he's trying to grapple with and cope with the fact that Rome has changed from a republic, that is a self-governing form of rule, into what is effectively a principality ruled by one man. And so we noted that in cases of extreme duress and struggle, and especially when civilizations are just coming into their being, into their infancy and growing to maturity, you need a leader. You need somebody who is going to point you in the direction and shape the development of the people. And Livy notes that if you let the people loose upon themselves too early, then they'll devolve essentially into mob rule. And they needed to develop a degree of sophistication and self-awareness so that they could create these forms of government. And we talked a little bit about the rudiments also of those forms of governments, which came into being under the kings, right? This idea, for example, that Romulus was king both because he seemed to have some kind of divine sanction, but also because he showed initiative and took ownership over that, and did so in a way that, despite being shocking, and Livy even says disgraceful, nevertheless, it qualifies him in a certain sense to be king. And the same was true of Numa Pompilius, the second king, who was a virtuous man and who established the ritual ordinances of Rome and how they would govern themselves in peacetime. And so you have basically all the seeds of Roman society set up in there, including this interregnum, where in between the reign of two kings, you have a period when the senators basically pass rule amongst themselves, and then the people vote and the senators ratify the vote for the new king. So it's not even then a pure hereditary monarchy, which this is one of, to be fair, right, that's one of the major kind of anacyclotic cycle of regimes complaints that people make about monarchy, is that you have one guy that's maybe good and virtuous and leads well, but then his son is raised in luxury and is spoiled and doesn't know, what it cost his father to take rule, and so the kingship declines and you get this inbreeding and all this stuff. That was not what we were facing in Rome from the beginning, because the Roman kingship was not hereditary. And so really what we're looking at now, and the reason I started with that passage from Samuel, that incredibly arresting passage from Samuel, is because, we're looking at understanding why kingship tends to fall apart, and why both Americans and Romans were led to reject kingship and found, even despite the strong, clear order that it gives, they were inspired to reject kingship and found their own form of government, namely the republic. And so it's not just about the hereditary kingship, it turns out. It's about the evil of people. And that is going to be my basic argument here. It's not something that you can improve out of a theory. It's just something that happens to be a fact of the world. And I've made this argument before about the fallenness of man, but I think it bears stressing again, because when you talk about political philosophy, people want you to make these syllogisms that are going to say, well, if this, then this, and therefore this, right? And you want to have these clear-cut kind of abstract theories. And of course, we've talked about many such theories on this show, and many of them are quite brilliant and insightful and helpful. The theory of anacyclosis, of the cycle of regimes, is a good example of a story that you tell about the structure of how things tend to work in the abstract. However, it's crucially important to remember when you're talking about history that you're not actually just talking about theory. You're also talking about the facts on the ground. And the facts on the ground include accidents. They include things that happen that nobody would have expected, that don't emerge from the logic, the internal logic of what's going on in a place, but come maybe from the outside. You have invading powers that, come in from war. You have chances and all this stuff that you can't predict with theory. And this is where, when people talk about statesmanship, they talk about the art, not just the science in the sense of learning the rules, but the art of intuiting what is best and in each situation responding on the ground to what's going on. It is my contention that one of the facts on the ground, not something that you can theoretically predict, but just a truth, is that mankind is fallen. And so even though you can imagine kingship working great, you can imagine the people always choosing virtuous kings and those virtuous kings leading the people strongly and succeeding, you can imagine that happening. But unfortunately, it simply doesn't. And you can never predict exactly the way in which it's going to do that, because it's not a theoretical thing. It's just a fact, and it just happens, right? So this is actually something, before I get into the second half of my description of Livy's kings, I want to read a passage from somewhere else, from Aristotle's Poetics, of all places. Now, the Poetics is Aristotle's work of literary criticism. It's actually, the first dedicated work of literary criticism that comes down to us in the West. And this is from chapter 9, or if you're reading the Becker pages, 1451b. Remember, this is the 4th century BC. It's about tragedy. He's got another work on comedy, but it's lost. But we'll talk more about the Poetics in detail later. I just want to read this passage where he says, Aristotle writes, "Indeed, the writings of Herodotus could be put into verse, and yet would still be a kind of history." This is about genre. Remember, Herodotus, first historian, right? Even if they were put into verse, they would still be a kind of history, whether written in meter or not. The real difference is this, that one tells what happened, and the other what might happen. Now, what might happen is poetry, and what happened is history, right? For this reason, poetry is something more philosophical and serious than history, because poetry tends to give general truths, while history gives particular facts. By a general truth, I mean the sort of thing that a certain type of man will do or say, either probably or necessarily. That is what poetry aims at in giving names to the characters. So if you have a character that's named, something that describes kind of the way that they act, which is a very common thing in Greek poetry and elsewhere, right? Then that, gives you this general idea about what kind of person this is. But a particular fact is what Alcibiades did or what was done to him. And so that's the object of history. This is really important. It's almost said in passing as a way of getting at poetry, but it's one of the most important observations that Aristotle has about history, right? When he says it's more philosophical, he means that it's more philosophical because it deals in likelihoods and in probabilities. And another thing that deals in likelihoods and probabilities is science, right? Science tells you how, according to the logic of the physical universe, X follows Y, follows, and is followed by Z, and so forth, right? That's how science works. But one of the reasons why relying only on science gives you an impoverished view of the world is because there are more things, to paraphrase Hamlet, right, on heaven and earth than are dreamt of in our philosophy. And history, weirdly, is actually less philosophical precisely because it deals with the realities of what happened, the facts of what happened. Human depravity is one of those things. It's not this kind of abstract idea that you argue out. It's just something that you have to account for and count on happening, even if you can't predict the way that people are going to screw it up. And this is one major reason why in the Federalist, the American founders defend their system of government, because as they say, if men were angels or if men were governed by angels, then all of this would be unnecessary. But what we're actually doing is we're calibrating our knowledge that people suck, and factoring that in and trying to provide for it in a bunch of different ways, depending on which way it's going to come out into being. So we are going to see one way in which people come to suck, and that is in the history of the kings after Numa Pompilius. But before we leap in, let me say, as I always do, I'm really glad you're here. I really, really am. It's true. Thank you for being here. If you haven't already, and if you like this show, please subscribe. You can do that anywhere. You can do it, on Google Play, on Apple podcasts. You can do it on Stitcher, but whatever you use, just hit subscribe, and that way you'll get a new episode every week. You can also, and this really helps the show, you can leave us a 5-star review on iTunes. Now, there's currently a special going on, and this is the last time that you'll have this opportunity. People who are not on Twitter can't ask me mailbag questions that way, but if you have a question that you would like me to answer, leave a 5-star review, then ask your question in the text of your 5-star review, and I'll do an episode where I just answer those questions, as many of them as I can get to, which should be a lot. So please do leave that 5-star review, and then ask the question if you'd like. And you can do that too, even if you're on Twitter, but you want to make sure that you get into this particular special episode, go ahead and do that. Anyway, thanks for being here. Please subscribe, and let's leap in, right? So remember, once again, the disclaimer that we're talking here not only about what is known to Livy of Rome's early history, but also a lot of legendary material that he's picking up and recycling and puzzling over, trying to understand the meaning of. He's aware, right? He's aware that, not all myths are factually true, but he's looking back from the Augustan era, first centuries BC and AD, and just after Augustus dies as well, after 14. And, when we left off, we had seen that the wise and virtuous king Numa Pompilius had died. And he was the one who established Rome's religious institutions. Numa sort of set up how people were going to live during peacetime and what the structure of their society would look like even during war at home. So Numa dies, and we are told then that Rome has gone from being this scrappy ragtag upstart to being almost revered. So here's what Livy says about this. He says, by these means, that is, by the reign of Numa Pompilius, the whole population of Rome was given a great many new things to think about and attend to, with the result that everybody was diverted from military preoccupations. They now had serious matters to consider, and believing as they now did that the heavenly powers took part in human affairs, they became so much absorbed in the cultivation of religion, and so deeply imbued with the sense of their religious duties, that the sanctity of an oath had more power to control their lives than the fear of punishment for lawbreaking. Men of all classes took Numa as their unique example and modeled themselves upon him until the effect of this change of heart was felt even beyond the borders of Roman territory. Once Rome's neighbors had considered her not so much as a city as an armed camp in their midst, threatening the general peace. Now they came to revere her so profoundly as a community dedicated wholly to worship that the mere thought of offering her violence seemed to them like sacrilege. Now, this is the benefit of all these institutions that Numa establishes. And note, right, that, he, as I said before, he does it not entirely out of full conviction that all of the stories he's telling are true, but they do convey certain moral realities to the Roman people that they then live by. Like that thing about the breaking of an oath, right? The idea that you shouldn't break an oath because it's sacred and not because you might get punished, that's Aristotelian virtue ethics, right? That's this idea that you should be wanting to do what's right because it's good or sacred, right? And not because you are going to get punished, right? So there's a kind of moral training going on here, this development of a people in its infancy, and so that's sort of how Rome becomes what it is supposed to be as a society, not just as an armed camp, in Livy's words, right? There follows another interregnum, so this period where they basically pass the power to the senators, and then the people choose a king, and the person that they pick is named Tullus Hostilius, and he's grandson of one of the heroes who fought against the Sabines. So he's got this sort of respectable pedigree, and they're kind of picking him in the hopes that some of that virtue will have passed on to him. So that's what I'm going to read about now. So Tullius Hostilius, grandson of the Hostilius who fought the fine action on the lower slopes of the Palatine against the Sabines, was elected to succeed Numa. He proved a very different man from his predecessor. Indeed, in his lust for action, he surpassed Romulus himself, driven as he was along the path of adventure by his grandfather's fame and the strength of his own young manhood. In his view, Rome had been allowed to lapse into senility, and his one object was to find cause for renewed military adventure. Now, we've seen just this before in a totally different context, which was in the context when we talked about Beowulf. We talked about how Beowulf himself goes looking for trouble because he exists in this kind of warlord culture where to make a name for yourself and for your men, you have to go hunting a challenge. And Tacitus, the Roman historian, says something quite similar about the Germanic tribes, who, of course, remember, predate these early Anglo-Saxon English legends. Now, this is who Tullius is. He's like a young, ambitious, spirited, warlordy guy. And what's funny is that this isn't really, this isn't a bad thing per se, but it's just he's sort of out of his place now. There's something a little bit excessive about it, and we're going to see. Even though he does, it's not as if each of these kings is a nightmarish villain. It's just that the principles upon which they are chosen, and the fact that they're chosen without people having taken into account the developing circumstances leads to this kind of eventual decay. So we see at this point that Rome has developed into this civilized state with rituals and traditions. But within that context, Hostilius goes searching for trouble, and he says it so happened that a series of reciprocal cattle raids was going on across the borders of Roman and Alban territory, ruled at that time by Gaius Cluilius. From both states, envoys were sent almost simultaneously to negotiate the recovery of the stolen property. The Roman party had orders to carry out their instructions immediately they arrived. Their demand would certainly be refused, and the refusal would allow Tullus to declare war with good conscience. The envoys from Alba were less prompt in coming to business. Welcomed by Tullus with every mark of gracious hospitality, they attended the state banquet as if nothing were amiss, while the Roman envoys had already made their demand for restitution and replied to Cluilius' refusal by a declaration of war to take effect in 30 days. They then returned to Rome and made their report, whereupon Tullus asked the envoys from Alba to state the object of their mission. Not knowing what had happened, they replied, not without embarrassment, that the last thing they wanted was to say anything disagreeable to their host, but orders were orders, and it was their duty to declare that they had come to demand restitution of stolen property and to declare war in the event of a refusal. Tell your king, Tullus answered, that the king of Rome calls the gods to witness which of our two peoples was the first to refuse the demand for redress. Our prayer is that the guilty nation may suffer all the misery of the coming war. So, he basically pulls a trick, right? He basically just starts this fight by making an aggressive demand and then, not revealing until the crucial moment that had happened. And so he gets to basically point to Cluilius and to Alba as the initiator of this fight. And they enter essentially into battle. So this is the source of one of the most famous episodes in all of Roman history. It's got an incredible painting, an iconic painting by Jacques-Louis David, which is it was in 1784. He makes this painting, The Oath of the Horatii. And so the story goes that there are these two families, each with 3 sons. And Livy expresses a little doubt about which group of sons is Roman and which group is Alban, but he says probably the Roman ones were called Horatii, and then the Curiatii are the Alban ones. And so here is this famous description. The 6 champions made ready for battle. As they stepped forward into the lists between the 2 armies, their hearts were high, and ringing in their ears were the voices of friends, bidding them to remember that their parents, their country, and their country's gods, their fellow soldiers, and all they loved at home would be watching their prowess, and that all eyes were on their swords. The rival armies were still in position. Danger there was none, but every man present was tense with anxiety. The stakes were very high. Upon the luck or valor of 3 men hung empire or slavery. In an agony of suspense, the onlookers prepared for the spectacle. This is almost right out of the Iliad, right? These champions ranging for the fight. The trumpet blares. The brothers drew their swords, and with all the pride of embattled armies advanced to the combat. Careless of death and danger, each thought only of his country's fate, of the grim choice between lordship and ignominy, which they themselves and they only were about to decide. They met. At the flash of steel and the clang of shield on shield, a thrill ran through the massed spectators, breathless and speechless, while as yet neither side had the advantage. Soon the combatants were locked in a deadly grapple. Bodies writhed and twisted, the leaping blades parried and thrust, and blood began to flow. Alba's 3 champions were wounded, a Roman fell, then another, stretched across his body, and both at the point of death. A cheer burst from the Alban army, so it looks like Alba's going to win here, right? And the 2 Romans went down, while from their adversaries all hope was gone. Life seemed to drain from them as they contemplated the dreadful predicament of their one survivor, surrounded by the 3 Curiatii. So, right, the Curiatii now look like they're about to win, and these are the Albans. The one Roman, the young man, though alone, was unhurt. No match for his 3 opponents together, he was yet confident of his ability to face them singly, and with his purpose in mind, he took to his heels, sure that they would be after him with such speed as their wounds allowed. Not far from the scene of the first fight, he looked back. His 3 enemies were coming, strung out one behind the other, the foremost almost upon him. He turned and attacked him furiously. A cry rose from the Alban army. "Your brother, save him!" But it was too late. Horatius had already killed his man and, flushed with triumph, was looking for his next victim. The Romans' cheer for their young soldier was like the roar of the crowd at the race when luck turns defeat into victory. Horatius pressed on to make an end. He killed his second man before the last, near though he was, could come to his aid. Now it was 1 against 1. And note, Livy makes it explicit here, right, that he's comparing this to some of the spectacles, the sports spectacles that Rome was accustomed to watching in his day, right? So the 2 antagonists were far from equally matched in all else that makes for victory. Horatius was unhurt and elated by his double success. His opponent, exhausted by running and loss of blood, could hardly drag himself along. His brothers had been killed before his eyes. He was a beaten man facing a victorious enemy. What follows cannot be called a fight. I have killed 2 already, the Roman cried. To avenge my brother's ghosts, I offer the last. To settle our quarrel, that Rome may be mistress of Alba. With these proud words, he plunged his sword with a downward stroke into the throat of his enemy, now too weak to sustain his shield, and then stripped him where he lay. So this is the great stuff that you get in the opening of Livy, right? Because he's so excited by it, you can tell, and also he's writing in this kind of semi-legendary past. This is kind of interesting, right? Because we see for the first time a crisis in which Rome has to decide once and for all what it's going to do with the excess of its martial enthusiasm. So remember I talked about how it's got all of this pent up, not in many cases not pent up, but just explosive manly energy that sort of founded the place. The rape of the Sabine women and the subsequent peacemaking between the Sabines and the Romans was a big step on the road to kind of calming that down. But we're still in this period where Rome could go one way or another. And remember that Tullus Hostilius himself kind of represents this resurgence of that aggression, that unfettered aggression that led to this war in the first place. But what happens is that the winning Horatius, right? This is Publius, is the name of the brother that wins the fight and at the last. He has a sister, and his sister was betrothed to one of the Curiatii, who are now dead, right? And because she weeps for his death, because she's sad to see her fiance killed, he kills her, and he says, "So perish all Roman women who mourn for an enemy." And so this is a genuine crisis, because this man has just heroically saved Rome from subjugation. He's a hero. He's a public hero, and yet he's done this barbaric thing. I mean, this is it's completely out of line to say that a woman shouldn't mourn her dead fiance, even if they had in the end, even if he had to die, even if they were up against him as champion of an enemy. And so this just unremitting, unsparing fury warrants, legally speaking, warrants the death penalty. So they condemn him to death, but his father intercedes on his behalf, and he makes this very moving speech, and he does a few sort of ceremonies. He's instructed to do a few ceremonies to expiate the guilt at his own expense. And so it's this delicate matter of civic character, right? As the father says, are you really going to make an example out of this man so that anybody who wants to help Rome is going to, remember my son, Publius Horatius, and stop doing it? But on the other hand, right, Rome can't possibly just let this go unanswered. And so they find this sort of compromise that says, this is not the sort of thing that we do, but we also, don't show ingratitude to our champions. Notably, in all of this, Tullus Hostilius himself reveals some weakness of character. So the king, right, when it comes time to convict him, Livy writes, Tullus shrank from the responsibility of passing the death sentence, which must, in the circumstances, prove unpopular. So he summoned a mass meeting and informed the populace of his intention to appoint the special officers known as duumvirs to convict Horatius of treason according to the regular law. So this is somebody who has been placed by hereditary credit in leadership. I don't want to be too hard on him, because he's not, the abject worst of what kingship can be, but, out of the kind of, you don't want to call it idolatry, but just this sense of kind of superstition around the children of great men, the people elevate him to power, and he's just not the right leader for the time, right? He's got this kind of weird combination of personal ambition, but lack of servitude, right? Lack of willingness to step up and do the hard thing, make the death sentence or not. He kind of shoves it off on these duumvirs. And it's decided, essentially, that eventually he's just doing too much war, right? He keeps fighting, and there's an outbreak of plague, and Tullus himself, right, insists on keeping up the war. At this point, they're still at war, and he just won't stop until he gets the plague himself, which is telling, right? He has his own sort of life affected, and then he decides it's decided that they've angered the gods. Tullus tries to propitiate them, but fails, and the palace is struck by lightning, and he dies. So Livy says he won glory as a great soldier, but that he meets this kind of gory end. And so that's the kind of first step on, these things are complicated, right? It's not as if I can say, like, and this was the great, fall of Rome, or Rome's kingship, rather. And it's not as if I can say, that this person was all good. It's just that this is a complicated man who had been, placed in a difficult position, not entirely on the basis of his own merit, and there were problems, and there was no safeguard against the problems because it was a monarchy. So there's another interrex, right, another period in between these two kings, and then comes Ancus Marcius, grandson on his mother's side of Numa Pompilius. So again, this kind of aristocratic idea about who should be in charge. Well, look to the heirs of those people that we liked before. And these Romans at this point, the Romans are hoping for another Numa. They think that if they get somebody from Numa's line, then they'll go back to peace, and they're just so war weary. And this is this aspect of decay, right? That the idea that you can recreate the good old days by treading back over the same ground, right? But in fact, it turns out, as always happens, right? Recreation never works. It's resurrection and reinvention that works, right? But because Ancus is not Numa, he's not the same person, and Rome has changed, right? So Livy tells us that Ancus had something of Numa and something of Romulus too. He well understood the value of a policy of peace when Rome was young and her people still somewhat wild, but at the same time he knew he could not himself enjoy without injury the tranquility which, in Numa's reign, had brought such benefits. Hostile peoples were already beginning to prick him to see how much he would stand, and the result was not to his credit. Times were difficult and called for a Tullus rather than a Numa. In one respect, however, Ancus did follow Numa's lead, though with a difference. Numa had established religious observances in times of peace. Ancus provided war with an equivalent solemn ceremonial of its own. It was not enough, he thought, that war should be fought. He believed that they should also be formally declared, and for this purpose he adopted from the ancient tribe of the Aequiculi the legal formalities now in the hands of the Fetials, which are priests, by which a state demands redress for a hostile act. So this is, again, you kind of see growing pains now, right? Rome is zigging when it should zag and zagging when it should zig. That you have this period of time when the king is too ambitious in the military, and that leads to this attempt to kind of swing the pendulum back to course correct, and you end up with this guy who's again wrong for the times, because now times, Livy says, are difficult. But he gives him the credit that he establishes, the rule of law is coming into being, essentially, and the traditions that say, well, we don't just go to war whenever we feel like it, well, we have this procedure in place. And that gives a certain degree of continuity and stability. In the end, the kind of verdict on Ancus is pretty decent, even though, he suffered from some deficiencies for the time. And this, again, is important. It's important to note that we're not just telling a story, a kind of like linear story of decline. We're talking here about the particularities of history and the different people who ended up in this role, which is an extremely high stakes role. Then intervenes something truly unexpected, something that actually alters the course of history. So from the Etruscan town of Tarquini, which is north of Rome, comes Lucumo, son of a Corinthian Greek named Demaratus. And Demaratus was a wealthy aristocrat and left basically all of his wealth to Lucumo because his brother Aruns died and left an heir, but Demaratus didn't know, and so basically that kid goes nowhere. He gets no money, and then Lucumo gets all of the inheritance. So Lucumo ends up in Tarquinii. He marries an aristocrat, Tanaquil, and Tanaquil is like kind of high maintenance. She is not about to give up her aristocratic status just to follow like love or wide-eyed innocence or whatever. And Livy says she was wholly bent upon seeing her husband enjoy the respect he deserved. And it turns out that ain't going to happen in Tarquinii. And so they set off for Rome, because in Tarquinii they're kind of feared and the people are suspicious of them. And they travel to Rome, and Livy tells the story on the journey, right? The pair had reached Janiculum and were sitting together in their carriage when an eagle dropped gently down and snatched off the cap which Lucumo was wearing. Up went the bird with a great clangor of wings until a minute later it swooped down again and, as if it had been sent by heaven for that very purpose, neatly replaced the cap on Lucumo's head. And then vanished into the blue. Tanaquil, like most Etruscans, was well skilled in celestial prodigies and joyfully accepted the omen, flinging her arms around her husband's neck. She told him that no fortune was too high to hope for. Only consider, she cried, from what quarter of the sky the eagle came. What god sent it as his messenger? Did it not declare its message by coming to your head, the highest part of you? Did it not take the crown, as it were, from a human head, only to restore it by heaven's approval where it belongs? Thus, dreaming upon future greatness, Lucumo and Tanaquil drove on into Rome, where they bought a house, and Lucumo took the name of Lucius Tarquinius Priscus, and this is the name he will eventually have as king. And Tanaquil pursues her ambition. Rome is a little more open-minded in its class dynamics, right? So the reason they couldn't make it in Tarquinii is because they were essentially Arivists. And in Rome, of course, they're all just getting started, and they're a little more open to, new arrivals, since they themselves are essentially a ragtag bunch grabbed from everywhere. Still, it's been a few generations, but still. Now, Lucius Tarquinius Priscus, as he's now called, kind of gets in with Ancus, who is the king at the time, right? After the death of Ancus, Tarquinius is kind of in charge of the household, and he develops this plot. He sends the king's sons away on a hunting trip and essentially runs a campaign for king. He's like, gives a stump speech. And this is, even a non-hereditary monarchy reaps these wages, that there's so much power at stake that people will do anything, right? And this really is, he's betraying this man who's been good to him, who's taken him in. So he basically steals the kingship out from under the feet of Ancus' sons by making his own case in front of the people. While they are ruling, this interesting thing happens, which kind of shows you again what is at stake here. So in the palace, about this time, there occurred a very odd thing, which was to have remarkable consequences. A little boy named Servius Tullius was lying asleep when his head burst into flames. Many people saw it happen. The noise and excitement caused by such an extraordinary event came to the ears of the king and queen and brought them hurrying to the spot. A servant ran for water and was about to throw it on the flames when the queen stopped him, declaring, so soon as she could make herself heard, that the child must on no account be disturbed, but allowed to sleep till he awoke of his own accord. A few minutes later, he opened his eyes and the fire went out. Tanaquil took her husband aside, where they could not be overheard. Listen, she said, this child we are bringing up as if he were no better than a beggar. Believe me, he will one day prove a light in our darkness, a prop to our house in the day of its affliction. We must see that he is taught and tended from now onward with every care, as one through whom will come great glory to our family and to Rome. The story goes that from that instant the child was treated like a prince of the blood and received a prince's education. It was the will of heaven, and all went well. He grew in time to be a man of truly royal nature, and when Tarquin was looking for a son-in-law, he could find no one in Rome comparable in any way to young Servius, so to Servius he betrothed his daughter. As Servius Tullius grows up, of course, he becomes the object of terrible resentment, because now we have, generations of that double dealing around this object of power, which has become an object in and of itself, right? It's not just glory that Tanaquil wants for Rome, it's also glory for herself and for her husband. And so there's this, turning of the mind away from, this is a function that needs to be served in our society, because, well, for any number of reasons, but because we need leadership, because this is how our traditions work, right? And the kings that I've described so far, I think it's fair to say, even if they have had, Tullus Hostilius is really, I think, the most kind of ambitious and self-obsessed king that I've mentioned so far. But we've seen a lot of examples of kingship genuinely for Rome, and that's, of course, one of the defining distinctions between true monarchy, which is leadership, servant leadership for the state and for the people, versus tyranny, which is comes to mean basically self-obsessed leadership for the sake of one's own power. And so we're starting to see the monarchy, the kingship, become an object of scheming and desire in and of itself. And that brings out the worst in people. It creates this situation in which the ugly parts of humanity are bound to show themselves. So as Servius Tullius grows up, the sons of Ancus get very upset with him, and they've always obviously resented having had the kingship stolen from them, which is what Livy says next. So The two sons of Tarquin's predecessor Ancus had always bitterly resented the trickery by which Tarquin had got them out of the country when he was their guardian and robbed them of their rights. It was bad enough in their view that a mere immigrant, not even of native Italian blood, should be king of Rome, but the future prospect was more intolerable still, for now it seemed, even after Tarquin's death, the throne, instead of reverting to them, its rightful heirs, was to sink into the hands of slaves. An abyss indeed. Servius, the slave woman's son. So he rises from this position of servitude right into this. He's basically picked out by heaven. Was to possess the power which 100 years before had been enjoyed by Romulus. Romulus, the son of a god and himself divine. If foreigners and slaves could rule in Rome while sons of Ancus still lived, it would be not only an insult to the blood royal, but a disgrace to the Roman name. The violence of their resentment suggested a desperate remedy. Only one sword could save Rome from her shame. Tarquin himself, not Servius, was their intended victim, and that for good reason. First, because the king, if he survived, would have more power to avenge the murder than a subject would have. Secondly, because if Servius were killed, the king would certainly choose some other son-in-law who would ultimately inherit the throne. They laid their plans accordingly to murder the king and picked two country fellows, both desperate characters, to do the deed. These men, they were shepherds, armed with the rough country tools they were accustomed to use, presented themselves at the entrance court of the palace. Now, I suspect there's some artistry going on here on Livy's part, right? Because remember when Romulus and Remus were basically shepherds and they were mounting an armed resistance against the usurper, right? This was, they were being helped by Numitor against Amulius, and they basically, are being mirrored here, but by these hired thugs. And there's this sense of kind of repeating, going back over the same ground, but in a time when it's inappropriate and in a way that has been basically corrupted by all these base desires. So these men presented themselves at the entrance court of the palace, where they started brawling or pretending to brawl, and raised such a racket that all the attendants came crowding around them to see what the matter was. One after the other, the two ruffians appealed to the king at the top of their voices until their shouts penetrated the inner rooms and they were summoned into the king's presence. For a while they tried to shout each other down until the king's lictor had had enough of it. He managed to stop them and told them to say what they had to say one at a time. Then the first, according to the plan, started to put his case, and while the king was listening to him, the other from behind split his skull with an axe, leaving the weapon in the wound. Both men then made a dash for the door. So it's kind of deliciously gory. We come up again against this terrible complication, right? Because this is an act of hideous effrontery and shameless ambition. And yet, it's been done. So what's going to happen, right? Hardly had the dying Tarquin been lifted by his attendants before the fugitives were caught by the lictors. There was an uproar. Excited crowds gathered, eager to know what the trouble was. Tanaquil ordered the palace gates to be closed. Then, getting rid of all who might observe what she was about, she began to prepare remedies for the wound as if there was still hope of saving the king's life, at the same time taking certain other precautions in case her plan should fail. A few minutes later, she sent for Servius. Seizing his hand, she directed his gaze to the king, now at the point of death, and begged him not to leave the murder unavenged, or allow herself to be a creature of contempt in the eyes of those who hated her. Servius, she cried, the throne is yours, if you are a man. It shall never be theirs who have done this deed of blood. Rise to your true stature. Follow the god who long ago by the circlet of heavenly fire declared that your head should wear the crown. Let the memory of those flames, assuredly divine, rouse you to act. Now is the time. Now you must awake indeed. The king and I were foreigners, yet the throne was ours. Forget your origins, and remember only what you are, your manhood. What? The sudden shock has numbed your wits? What matter? Do as I bid you, and all will be well. Meanwhile, the noise and excitement in the street were getting out of hand. The queen hurried to an upper room of the palace, and flinging open a window which looked out onto the street, began to address the crowd. She urged them to be calm. The king, she declared, had been stunned by a blow. It was a surface wound only. This is like Monty Python, right? 'Tis but a flesh wound. Already he had recovered consciousness. The wound had been cleaned and examined, and there was every reason for confidence. Meanwhile, without any doubt, they would soon see him again for themselves. Meanwhile, she begged them to give their loyal obedience to Servius, who would see justice done, and in all other ways deputize for the king. This is a very, very sneaky scheme, a kind of counterblow, right? Blood follows blood. They're now just playing the Game of Thrones, essentially. And as you know, when you play the Game of Thrones, you win or you die. So that's what they're doing. They're all fighting over this object of power. And eventually Tanaquil kind of has the upper hand, right? She ends up getting her way. Servius ends up on the throne. Servius Tullius. This is like a break in the evil, right? He has looked back upon Servius Tullius as being extremely virtuous and one of the most important figures in the Roman state. Again, this is semi-legendary, and so the origins of the things that he did may themselves be, certainly are themselves deeper and more complicated than the story that's told, but he's represented as introducing the reforms that create the census, and the census leads to what we talked about when we talked about the Gracchi, which is the Comitia Centuriata, and that's how Rome voted. I mean, there were more reforms to come, but it's not the bicameral style thing that we would eventually get when the plebeians would demand the concilium plebis, which is the kind of lower class, the ability for the lower class to have a space of their own to operate in. So it's a move away from the situation in which the patrician families are assigned, basically their own little fiefdom, and it's very, very close to feudalism. What they had before, that the plebeians were essentially, under the tutelage and the ownership of these patricians, and now we're moving in the direction of representation. That these they're called centuries, even though they don't contain 100 people, and they're given different amounts depending on their wealth. And remember, there's so much power on the table, right? And this is like a thing in which there's this, Rome is now becoming a serious going concern, and as such, they have to figure out how they're going to distribute the wealth, and they're going to distribute the ability to kind of earn and get wealth. And so the kingship has become this object of great desire, but also at the same time, there are these kind of pre-republican reforms going on. And so Servius Tullius develops this situation within which he says, of those whose property was rated at a capital value of 100,000 asses or more, 80 centuries were formed, 40 of seniors and 40 of juniors. This whole group was known as the first class. The seniors were for civil defense, the juniors were for service in the field. All were required to equip themselves with helmet, round shield, greaves, and breastplate. Note this, we don't talk about this a lot when we talk about voting mechanisms, right? The establishment of political power in Rome comes along with military responsibilities. And this is, the fact that it's classist is mitigated by the fact that those who get more rights get more responsibilities. All of that having been said, right, these are voting blocks. And so he's assigning more power to the wealthy and less to the not so wealthy. But remember that his own humble origins it's going some of the way to explaining how these reforms get attributed to him, right? It's the story of this guy that rises up. He's basically picked up by heaven out of poverty and out of just nowhere to become the king of Rome. And so there's a certain kind of return to that old virtue in this, but there's also, there's the recipe for everything to go terribly wrong. It's a very precarious situation to be starting to vest all this power in the people, but also showing that the kingship is kind of up for grabs for anybody that wants to just reach out and take it. What's the situation? Well, Servius is giving structure to the Roman voting process, which remember has been evolving simultaneously with these kind of machinations of the kingship. And more you start to see that the people are invested in this form of kind of semi-representative government, which is taking a kind of maturity and shape even as the kingship decays. And so it's emerging even in embryo already, even though, the fact that the kingship is so powerful and the fact that it's, the object of all this ambition is causing all sorts of problems and bringing out people's innate sinfulness. Now, this all comes to the head with the ascendancy of Rome's seventh and final and worst king, Lucius Tarquin. So he's probably the son, maybe the grandson, Livy says, of Tarquinius Priscus, who remember is the last king but one. So before Servius Tullius, who was elevated in the house of Tarquinius Priscus. Remember, we had Tarquinius Priscus, formerly Lucumo, who had risen his way to the top and then basically shunted the sons of Ancus out of power. Now we come to a delicious series of stories. So we start here with these new arrivals. And this is another bolt from the blue that sort of changes things. We have, Lucius Tarquin teams up with another very ambitious woman who's one of Servius's daughters, Tullia. They end up basically becoming, they have, what's the word? They're birds of a feather, right? They have these sort of similar attitudes. two things. And Tarquin, Lucius Tarquinius, son or grandson, more probably the former, of Tarquinius Priscus, had a brother called Arens, a mild-mannered young man. The two brothers, as I mentioned before, had married Servius' daughters, both of them named Tullia, but in character diametrically opposed to each other. By what I cannot but feel was the luck of Rome, it so happened that the two fiercely ambitious ones, Tarquin and the younger Tullia, did not, in the first instance, become man and wife, for Rome was thereby granted a period of reprieve. Servius' reign lasted a few years longer, and Roman civilization was able to advance. The younger Tullia was bitterly humiliated by the weakness of her husband Arens, and fiercely resented his lack of ambition and fire. It was to Tarquin that the whole passion of her nature turned. Tarquin was her hero, Tarquin her ideal of a true man and a true prince. Her sister she despised for failing to support with a woman's courage the husband she did not deserve. There is a magnetic power in evil, like draws towards like, and so it was with Tarquin and the younger Tullia. It was the woman who took the first step along the road of crime. Whispers passed between her and her sister's husband. Their secret meetings grew more frequent, their talk less guarded. Soon she was pouring into his ears the frankest abuse of her sister and Arens, while Tarquin, though one was his brother and the other his brother's wife, let her talk on. You and I, she said, would have been better single than bound in marriage, so incongruous and absurd, where each of us is forced by a cowardly partner to fritter our lives away in hopeless inactivity. Ah, if God had but given me the husband I deserve, I should soon see in my own house that royalty which I now see in my father's. The bold words struck an answering fire. Two deaths soon followed, one close upon the other, and Tarquin found himself a widower, Tullia a widow. The guilty pair were then married, the king not preventing, but hardly approving the match. So this is the true, Tanaquil is kind of a Lady Macbeth figure, but Tullia is really a Lady Macbeth figure, and the two of them are made for each other, despite the fact, as Livy says, that this period under Servius Tullius is kind of an important pause in all of the depravity. But now we are really back on track. And so again, right, it's not that kingship, true kingship, good kingship, couldn't continue in perpetuity. It's just that it doesn't, because there are people like this, and because people in general, right, all have something dark within them that is basically, ready to spring out when given the right provocation. And for some people, it is power. So Tarquin, Livy says, could not stand against Tullia's maniacal ambition. And in an act of open sedition, he starts blackening the king's name, and he forces his way eventually into the forum with armed guards. There's an open conflict between, remember, the sitting king and the man who has dared to unseat him. So this is bad mojo for a regime, right? When you feel like you can just walk in with enough military force and take this guy out, that's not a regime. That's, that's a banana republic. It's an autocracy. It's whatever. But the rule of law has basically lost its grounding. And again, it's likely to happen when you have power tempting the darkness in the heart of men. So with Servius, Livy says, true kingship came to an end. Never again was a Roman king to rule with humanity and justice. And so there again is the distinction between true kingship, which comes with humanity and justice, and then what the lust for power invites, which is the decay of kingship and tyranny. And Tarquinius Superbus, nicknamed the Proud, surely earns his name, right? He's basically out for his own power. He's incredibly good at it. He cooks up these accusations against his political enemies. So, like, for example, he's trying to make himself just as powerful among the Latins. Remember them from the days of Aeneas. These are this other kind of venerable tribe of people. He makes alliances among them just as easily as with Romans. He cooks up this basically lie about Turnus, who kind of among the Latins dares to oppose him. He's a me first guy. He does well at war, but through trickery. So for example, and this is one of the big stories, right? He pretends that he's not going to fight with this neighboring town of Gabii, and then he sends his son Sextus to just play this incredibly long game. So he basically Sextus gains the favor of all the nobles in Gabii. He becomes trusted, he becomes respected, and then he becomes a war hawk against Rome. So it's like, surely I can't be on Rome's side. I'm trying to get you to go to war with him. And then we get this story, which is it's right out of Herodotus. So it's obviously some kind of myth that's being repurposed. But he sends a messenger. He's basically risen up the ranks in Gabii, Sextus has, and he sends a messenger to his father Tarquinius, and Tarquinius says nothing but just goes out and lops off the heads of the tall poppies. And this is this coded message that Sextus understands, and he kills the most preeminent men in Gabii. Now, this kind of thing doesn't stand, right? I mean, it's not that it can't do a whole ton of damage, but when you have somebody this openly brazen, this just self-aggrandizing and arrogant, eventually something has got to give. And so what gives in this case is that you have Brutus, whom I mentioned in the last episode, that this is actually, it's the ancestor of the Brutus who would eventually kill Caesar. But the son of the king's sister is this Brutus is the son of the king's sister. So he's Lucius Junius Brutus, and he is biding his time. He's pretending to be basically mentally handicapped, and he carries around a staff of cornel wood, which conceals a rod of solid gold. So he's got this kind of cunning, wait and see aspect. He knows he's under an evil regime. He's sent on an envoy to Delphi, which is where the prophetess of Apollo gives prophecies, and he's told that the first man to kiss his mother will be king. And so others think, well, when we go home, we'll strive to kiss our mothers. But he pretends to fall to the ground, and then he kisses the earth, which of course is mother of us all. And so then we get this kind of twist on the Candaules story that I told a while back. Remember the story about the guy who fell in love with his own wife? Fast forward, the Romans are trying to take Ardea. They're involved in one of their many wars, and so they're in the process of this, right? The attempt was made to take Ardea by assault. It failed. Siege operations were begun, and the army settled down into permanent quarters. With little prospect of any decisive action, the war looked like being a long one, and in these circumstances, leave was granted quite naturally, with considerable freedom, especially to officers. Indeed, the young princes, at any rate, spent most of their leisure enjoying themselves in entertainments on the most lavish scale. So this is a good example. When I talk about like a failed elite and just an oligarchy, this is kind of what it is. It's luxury, it's entitlement, it's just, enriching oneself at the expense of the people. And we've seen plenty of that, I think, during coronavirus lockdowns, it's fair to say. They were drinking one day in the quarters of Sextus Tarquinius. Collatinus, son of Agerius, was also present when someone chanced to mention the subject of wives. Each of them, of course, extravagantly praised his own, and the rivalry got hotter and hotter until Collatinus suddenly cried, "Stop! What need is there of words when in a few hours we can prove beyond doubt the incomparable superiority of my Lucretia? We are all young and strong. Why shouldn't we ride to Rome and see with our own eyes what kind of women our wives are? There is no better evidence, I assure you, than what a man finds when he enters his wife's room unexpectedly." They had all drunk a good deal, as you surely would have had to in order to think this was a good idea, and the proposal appealed to them, so they mounted their horses and galloped off to Rome. They reached the city as dusk was falling, and there the wives of the royal princes were found enjoying themselves with a group of young friends at a dinner party in the greatest luxury. The riders then went on to Collatia, where they found Lucretia very differently employed. It was already late at night, but there, in the hall of her house, surrounded by her busy maidservants, she was still hard at work by lamplight upon her spinning. Which wife had won the contest in womanly virtue was no longer in doubt, right? So this is a recipe for envy, for jealousy. The third and youngest son of Tarquinius Superbus, Sextus, right, is so inflamed with passion for Lucretia that he shows up in the night and he rapes her. It's this really heartrending scene, and Lucretia herself basically calls for the defense of her honor. Now, Brutus has kind of been waiting for his chance, although, of course, this is in and of itself a really terrible thing. But there's this heart-wrenching scene in which it is basically kicked off, right? The unhappy girl wrote to her father in Rome and to her husband in Ardea, urging them both to come at once with a trusted friend and quickly, for a frightful thing had happened. Her father came with Valerius, Valisa's son, her husband with Brutus, with whom he was returning to Rome when he was met by the messenger. They found Lucretia sitting in her room in deep distress. Tears rose to her eyes as they entered, and to her husband's question, "Is it well with you?" she answered, "No. What can be well with a woman who has lost her honor? In your bed, Collatinus, is the impress of another man. My body only has been violated. My heart is innocent, and death will be my witness. Give me your solemn promise that the adulterer shall be punished. He is Sextus Tarquinius. He it is who last night came as my enemy, disguised as my guest, and took his pleasure of me. That pleasure will be my death, and his too, if you are men. The promise was given one after another. They tried to comfort her. They told her she was helpless and therefore innocent, that he alone was guilty. It was the mind, they said, that sinned, not the body. Without intention there could never be guilt. What is due to him, Lucretia said, is for you to decide. As for me, I am innocent of fault, but I will take my punishment. Never shall Lucretia provide a precedent for unchaste women to escape what they deserve. With these words, she drew a knife from under her robe, drove it into her heart, and fell forward dead. Now, I want to pause here because, of course, this is an incredibly moving and upsetting scene, right? I mean, the horror of this innocent woman, completely innocent woman, having, been first raped and then committing suicide, strikes us with a mixture of feelings that is very difficult to process in modernity. It's a good example of something for which modern sexual ethics does not prepare us in a particularly good way. Because, of course, we talk all the time about, we're very insistent, and rightly, of course, that women who are raped are not at fault. And Lucretia herself does not consider herself at fault. That's not what she says. She says, I don't want to be considered an example for others to be unchaste. So the thing that's complicated about this is it's impossible to see it and not admire a certain kind of nobility in it, right? You both say that this shouldn't have happened, that it was evil, that Lucretia was the victim 100% through and through, and that there is something admirable in what she does, even if it's far more severe than we would ever want to be. And to me, leaving our prejudices, our modern prejudices aside, teaches us something about this moment, which is that this is the wages of bad kingship, right? The wages of bad kingship, or indeed of people seizing power that they do not merit it at all. Virtuous people are forced in their virtue to do insane and terrible things, right? Lucretia's values, her honor, are what lead her into this chaos and tragedy. And that's the situation that happens when the world is turned upside down by people who don't care about virtue at all. The cost is always paid by people who follow their virtues to the end. And this, of course, is, the Christ story is the perfect example of this. It is the man who follows his virtue unto death, even though the world itself is hell-bent on the destruction of all things good. And, the Romans at this point are living in a world that has been reshaped by the people who have overweening power upon it to make it such that the virtuous path leads to tragedy and despair. Again, not at all saying that people who are raped should take their own lives. I'm saying that Lucretia, is living by her principles. And even if they're not our principles, we recognize the integrity of that. And we have to kind of be taken aback by the extremity with which she's willing to go for it, which is the extremity that built Rome, right? Rome, in the end, is made powerful by its dedication to its virtues and to its courage and to its honor, right? And all the things that Lucretia died for. And so she is this picture of the victim of how kingship and how overweening power creates these victims out of good people, right? That's what happens, and of course, it's the chance that Brutus has been waiting for. It's the end, really, of anything that good people could possibly stand by and support. And so Brutus basically stages a revolution. And here he says, with an armed body of volunteers, Brutus then marched for Ardea to rouse the army to revolt. Lucretius, who sometime previously had been appointed by the king prefect of the city, was left in command in Rome. Tullia fled from the palace during the disturbances. Wherever she went, she was met with curses. Everyone, men and women alike, called down upon her head the vengeance of the Furies, who punish sinners against the sacred ties of blood. When news of the rebellion reached Ardea, the king immediately started for Rome to restore order. Brutus got wind of his approach and changed his route to avoid meeting him, finally reaching Ardea almost at the same moment as Tarquin arrived at Rome. Tarquin found the city gates shut against him and his exile decreed. Brutus, the liberator, was enthusiastically welcomed by the troops, and Tarquin's sons were expelled from the camp. 2 of them followed their father into exile at Caira in Etruria. Sextus Tarquinius went to Gabii, his own territory as he doubtless hoped, but his previous record there of robbery and violence, remember this was the story of the poppy heads and of intrigue, basically insinuating himself, and violence made many enemies who now took their revenge and assassinated him. So it's hard not to feel a certain degree of satisfaction at the downfall of Tarquinius Superbus and his brood. But this is an uprising of moral indignation, and it depends upon the virtue of the people who in their role, their nascent role as the kind of bedrock of the Roman Republic, follow the dictates of their own civilization, which, even though it developed under a virtuous monarchy, has now taught them that this monarchy is evil and will not stand and has fallen to decay. I've argued already at length, and so I won't do it again, for why republics do better at balancing the evils of the various different forms of government against each other. But here's what I will say at the last, and I mentioned this already in the last episode, but I'm going to kind of dig into it a little bit more here, right? There is no going back. You don't kick a king out and then successfully return to monarchy. The republic is a more advanced form of government than the monarchy. And yes, does it tend to excesses within the various classes, the monarchic, the aristocratic, and the democratic element? Of course it does. Absolutely. We are currently seeing, in my view, the extreme decay of our aristocratic element into an oligarchy, into just sweaty autocrats who care about nothing except their own bottom line, who rule over us with no regard for their own, for their people, but only regard for themselves, right? We see them do things like, you watch videos of them putting on a mask to walk on stage and then taking it off to speak to the people, this like bizarre theater of political oppression. This is our problem. Our problem is not, in the end, the decay of the American people. The American people are under intellectual and moral assault. It is certainly true. But as I argued before, the people still have virtue, and they can still, the levers still exist, unlike in the Roman monarchy, where there had to be a revolution to kick the king out. And unlike in the American colonies, where there had to be a revolution to kick the kings out, what we have to do is marshal our civic virtues and get rid of these elites and stop depending on them, right? Stop sending your kids to their fancy schools, And I know that I'm one to talk because I went to all those fancy schools, but it's over, man. Like, we have to be about the business of sending our kids to classical schools and to going, finding the places in red states especially, but all over the country where little rebellions are occurring. And marshaling that civic virtue is what will get us to a place where we're able to form a new aristocracy, because we're already doing that, right? There are already all these people in media and in education and everywhere who are doing this work. They're just not getting recognition because our formal elite is so corrupt and so sclerotic. So in order to avoid the many dangers of kingship that I hope I have now argued for, which are dependent, again, as I say, upon the fallenness of humanity, if people were perfect, you could have kings forever, but it just doesn't work. We're past that point. And our job now is to save the country by being the people, the American people, who can, in fact, fight back against all of this. We can win. We are actually, in many places, we are already winning, and we just don't know it yet. All right, that's the kings of Rome. Let's do the mailbag. This mailbag question comes to me in a physical letter. And this is the second physical letter that I've gotten from this person, which is so cool. She, I think, I don't know. It's actually, the letter is signed WP, so I guess I don't know that it's a woman, but handwriting, I sort of assume it is. But she asks a really interesting question. Do you think that literary knowledge makes you more emotionally intelligent, meaning that it helps you understand yourself and your motivations at a higher level? And I think this is a really insightful question, and it speaks to a lot of the stuff that we've said on the show, right? That because we've lost a sense of the kinds of knowledge that are not physical, right, that are not science, we don't even know that there exists really, or we've lost our sense that there exists a whole body of knowledge that is not purely factual, as knowledge that has to do with insight and wisdom and moral intuitions, right? You can actually train yourself in that by living every day in a way that you aspire to live, by practicing what Aristotle would call phronesis, this practical wisdom of putting your principles into practice, seeing what they mean in each particular case. And yes, I think that that form of that whole sphere of intelligence that goes beyond knowing, the date when something happened, or beyond knowing the chemical compound that makes up sugar, like this whole sphere of intuition that has to do with, well, what is the good and what is right in each case, right? And what are the four cardinal virtues and all these things that we come to through the work that we do on this show, right? You can't actually, live everybody's life. And as I've argued, literature is the mechanism for conveying the experience of another's life to people, right? For putting into words or painting, or, if it's art, right, into visuals, what the inner life of a person or of another human being is. And so, yes, absolutely. I think that it doesn't gain you new information so much as it gains you a new perspective on the world that is yours then to kind of incorporate into your own phronesis, into your own intuitive understanding of how you're going to proceed in life in a virtuous way towards the good, the true, and the beautiful. I hope that answers your question. Thank you, WP, for sending me a physical paper. It makes me feel like a, gentleman intellectual of the 19th century. I love it. But if you don't want to write me on paper, and if you don't have Twitter, remember that we are still doing a promotion where if you leave us a 5-star review on iTunes and ask a question, I will do a special episode where I answer all of those questions. So please do that. Time is running out, but go ahead and do it. Thank you, as always, for being with us. If you like this show, you will love the Claremont Institute, where I work. We put out the Claremont Review of Books, which is a paper magazine, a quarterly, and the American Mind, which is online. Both of them, I think, are fantastic. And it's not just me who writes there, so I'm not totally biased in saying so. If you want to support our work in defense of the American ideals, then you go to claremont.org/donate and let them know that we sent you from Young Heretics. All right. Thanks again, as always, for being here. I will see you next week for more truth, beauty, and the stuff that matters.